Welcome to the Curious Case, where every mystery unfolds like a quiet storm over evening tea. Today we invite you into a story draped in whispers and wrapped in secrets, the kind that sit in the air long after the last word is spoken. We travel to the sleepy village of Elderbrook, where ivy clings to crumbling walls and secrets bloom in the cracks. A gathering is underway in the old town hall, lace doilies, teacups, and forced smiles in abundance. It's the centenary of the Thornwood disappearance, a celebration thinly veiled in ceremony, hiding something far darker. As Miss Marple steps into the hall, her instincts stir. There's a chill not caused by the weather, but by the history trapped in those walls. Eyes avoid hers. Conversations falter. A photograph of the missing bride, untouched by time, hangs crooked on the memorial board. The bride's twin sister stands near the punch bowl, expression carved in porcelain stillness, while the best man, now stooped with age, keeps glancing at the clock as if time might undo something. Children too young to know the truth giggle nervously, sensing the unspoken weight pressing down on their elders. And then, as the local historian clears his throat to begin the commemorative speech, the lights flicker. A hush falls. Miss Marple's fingers still on her knitting needles. She knows, this isn't just a memorial, it's a stage. And someone in this room is ready to finish the story that was never allowed to end. The rain came softly at first, like a whisper too afraid to speak aloud. By the time Eleanor Gray stepped into the ancient community hall of Dunbridge Hollow, it had become a steady rhythm against the arched windows, muffling voices, and lending the room a strange suspended stillness. Inside, the annual heritage tea was underway, lace tablecloths draped like ghosts over folding tables, silver spoons clinking gently in fine china cups. Smiles were worn politely, as expected, but the atmosphere was strained, like fabric stretched too tight. No one mentioned the anniversary, yet everyone felt it. 15 years to the day since the Reverend Whittaker's daughter vanished hours before her wedding. No body, no note, only a bouquet found floating in the church font. Eleanor, visiting after years abroad, accepted a scone and a glance from a woman she didn't recognize. A glance that lingered a second too long. On the far wall, a display of black and white photographs charted the village's history. First harvests, May Queen's christenings. But in the center, a jagged space stood empty, a square of faded wallpaper, where a photograph had clearly hung. She remembered that photo. Everyone did. It was the last one ever taken of Lillian Whittaker, smiling, radiant, fingers entwined with a man whose name no one spoke now. Eleanor stepped closer, her breath fogging the glass of the surrounding frames. Why had it been removed? Who had decided to erase her? And why now? Conversations behind her faltered, when the vicar rose to speak, his voice measured and slow, as if choosing each word from a shelf of delicate porcelain. When he reached the phrase, "those we lost and the love we carry," someone near the door dropped their teacup with a sharp crack. Heads turned. The vicar paused, and in that second of brittle silence, Eleanor heard it clearly, the unmistakable sound of a woman weeping, muffled, just beyond the hall's wooden doors. A sound not of mourning, but of release, like someone had waited years to finally let go. Eleanor's heart raced. There were stories buried here, carefully folded and hidden beneath layers of good manners and half-truths, and she had just heard one begin to unfold. The village hall echoed with polite laughter and polished teacups, but beneath the delicate china and lace tablecloths, something colder brewed, an unspoken tension that clung to the air like fog. No one mentioned the tragedy outright, but its shadow was unmistakable, lingering in every hesitant glance and half-swallowed sentence. At the edge of the room, nestled beside an ornate grandfather clock, stood an aging display of photographs, smiling faces, sunlit fairs, bridal veils frozen in time. Yet one space lay conspicuously empty, the faint rectangular imprint of a removed frame still visible. Evelyn Thorne, seated quietly by the window with her notebook folded on her lap, noticed it immediately. She remembered the photo, the engagement party, taken the day before the bride vanished. Everyone said she ran, a heartbroken escape under the cover of midnight. But Evelyn had always sensed otherwise. A whisper she'd overheard years ago returned to her now. It wasn't the bride who left first. The word struck her harder this time. The groom's brother too had disappeared. Not missing, but simply unmentioned. Erased as though his presence had become inconvenient to the carefully curated history. Evelyn caught the way his name was swallowed mid-sentence during the speeches. How eyes flicked to the floor when the toast turned sentimental. And then there was the old gardener, muttering to himself outside, claiming the family had buried more than their secrets beneath the garden stones. No one truly believed in the curse, of course, but Evelyn knew better. In places like this, stories become legends not because they're false, but because they're dangerous. She rose slowly, eyes scanning the hall, the laughter now feeling brittle, the smiles too tight. Someone in this room remembered what really happened, and someone else was desperate to make sure no one ever asked again. The church bells had barely faded when the first scream tore through the village green, slicing the tranquil evening like broken glass. The bride's veil, ghost white and trembling in the wind, was found snagged on the rusted gate of the old Holloway Manor, a place long abandoned, rumored cursed, and whispered about in hushed tones. Hours earlier, it had hosted an uninvited visitor, an elegantly dressed woman, with rain-slicked gloves, and eyes that scanned the gathering, like a ledger, cold and calculating. No one knew her name, and she never offered it. She had stood apart at the edge of the ceremony, her presence cloaked in politeness, but pierced with something darker. By morning, her body lay face down in the manor's overgrown garden, her hands clutching a torn bridal ribbon, and a crumpled telegram that simply read, "He knows." There were no signs of violence, no clear cause of death, just a stillness that felt wrong, too complete, as though time had paused around her. Inspector Alina Graves, called in from the nearby town, arrived under the guise of quiet efficiency. She noted the untouched soil beneath the body, the absence of footprints, the faint trace of jasmine in the air, despite no flowers growing nearby. The villagers claimed innocence, but Graves knew better. Guilt lived in glances, and fear showed its face in the silence between words. Whispers began to rise, a cursed vow, a vanished groom from decades ago, a family feud never resolved. One old man muttered of a pact made under a blood moon. Yet it was the locked drawer in the manor's drawing room, empty, save for a single black and white photograph of a wedding party with one face scratched out, that truly disturbed Graves. The storm that followed seemed fitting, as if the sky itself were mourning. But the inspector didn't flinch. She had come for answers, and St. Morwen's secrets, no matter how deeply buried, were about to be unearthed. The village of Elmbrook had always worn silence like a second skin. Old trees whispered secrets in the wind, and the fog that crept through its crooked lanes seemed to carry voices of the past. But when a well-dressed stranger was found dead on the threshold of the disused chapel, his hand curled around a cracked pocket watch, and a smear of something dark trailing from his collar, the air turned sharp with unease. The villagers, already unnerved by flickering sightings of a pale woman in mourning, who vanished whenever approached, whispered that the chapel was cursed, a place where time stood still for those who disturbed its peace. Yet for Evelyn Hart, a retired schoolteacher with a razor-sharp mind, and a habit of noticing the unnoticed, the pieces didn't fit the ghostly tale. She had seen the initials etched into the chapel door days before the body was found, had heard the strange tapping late one night that sounded less like spirit and more like code. When the local constable brushed the case off as a tragic accident, the gentleman must have taken ill. Evelyn kept her doubts quiet, but her instincts flared. The pressed rose found in his coat pocket matched the flowers left weekly on the grave of Eleanor Grace, a bride who'd vanished decades ago on the eve of her wedding, the chapel doors found locked from within, and her body never recovered. The man had clearly been digging, asking too many questions, pulling at threads someone didn't want unraveled. As Evelyn stood before the chapel again, the mist curling low and the stones cold beneath her feet, she wondered not just who had killed him, but what secret was buried deep enough to still kill for. Somewhere in the forgotten corners of the village's history, truth and lies had fused, and Evelyn knew that unless she untangled them quickly, the past would not rest, and neither would the dead. Miss Evelyn Woodhouse, a keen observer of the forgotten and overlooked, had always shown an uncanny fascination with the year 1923. Her sharp eyes gleamed with quiet resolve each time she unearthed another obscure detail about the ill-fated wedding. The village historian, an elderly man with a penchant for lingering on anecdotes, had often found himself caught in Evelyn's gentle yet relentless questioning. She asked the simplest of questions, names, dates and old rumors, and yet with each answer, her understanding deepened. It was not the information itself but the spaces between the words that drew her in. One afternoon, while sifting through fragile papers under the dim light of the dusty archives, Evelyn stumbled upon an entry that stopped her heart for a moment. A fleeting mention of a cancelled wedding license, noted with such cold indifference, that it felt more like an afterthought than a significant event. The reason for the cancellation was never recorded, nor was there any hint of the bride's sudden departure, or the groom's response. The entry was as clinical and detached as a footnote in a history book, yet Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the pages themselves were hiding something vital. She lingered over the records, her fingers brushing against the edges of the yellowing papers, as if coaxing them to reveal their truths. As she moved through the archive, a peculiar pattern began to emerge. Letters, some handwritten in a hasty script, were tucked away in corners and forgotten boxes. Evelyn's gaze lingered on the names that appeared time and time again, as though the ink itself was desperate to tell a story. The letters revealed a bitter history of old family feuds and unspoken grudges between the bride's family and the groom's. The engagement, once an idyllic promise, had soured long before the day of the wedding. In one particularly damning note, dated a year before the wedding was supposed to take place, there was mention of an explosive argument. The bride's father had reportedly demanded compensation for some slight, an insult, a betrayal, details left vague and only implied, while the groom's family wrote in defensive tones about promises broken and behavior unworthy of respect. The words were laced with resentment, disgrace, shame, dishonor, emotions so strong they practically leapt off the page. Evelyn could feel the tension, the invisible walls that had grown between these once close families, and with every letter she read, she could almost hear the whispered words exchanged in hidden rooms behind closed doors. The village had been a quiet place, but beneath its placid surface, a storm had been brewing for years. Pride, fear, and the suffocating weight of societal expectation had driven the families to the breaking point. And now, the unresolved bitterness was consuming everything in its path. Evelyn set the letters aside, letting their words rest in the silence of the archive. She felt the weight of their secrets pressing against her chest. This was no mere tale of a broken engagement. This was the foundation of a tragedy, one that had shattered not only the couple's lives but the very fabric of the village itself. As she left the archives, Evelyn knew one thing with certainty: the feud that had once simmered quietly had now turned deadly, and the ghosts of the past were not content to stay buried. They had come alive once more, and their revenge was only just beginning. As Miss Evelyn Woodhouse continued her search through the dusty archives, she stumbled upon a small, neatly bound bundle of letters wrapped in a faded ribbon. The scent of aged paper filled the air as she carefully unwrapped the bundle, her fingers tracing the faded edges. The handwriting on each page was different, some flowing and elegant, others rushed and uneven, but one letter immediately drew her attention. It was addressed to the bride, supposedly written by her fiancé, yet something about it felt wrong. The flourishes and spacing in the script were inconsistent, almost as if the writer had tried to mask their true intentions. Evelyn's eyes narrowed as she examined the ink blotches and uneven pen strokes, a growing sense of unease creeping up her spine. The content of the letter was brief, almost chilling, an ominous suggestion that the fiancé wanted to call off the wedding at the last minute. However, certain words didn't match his usual style. Phrases like "your betrayal" and "my broken trust" rang hollow, feeling rehearsed and artificial, as if someone else's voice was manipulating the words. Evelyn's pulse quickened as she carefully lifted the letter. Her keen eye caught something else, a final stroke at the bottom, hastily altered, as though someone had gone back and tried to erase their own mistake. It was a forgery, crafted to appear authentic enough to devastate the bride without raising suspicion. Whoever had written this letter, Evelyn realized, had intended to shatter the bride's trust in the most cruel way possible. The letter, received on the eve of the wedding, was the catalyst for the bride's hasty flight, or so she had believed. But now, Evelyn could see that this deception was far more calculated than she had first imagined. The question lingered in her mind: who had forged this letter, and what was their true motive? What secrets lay behind this deliberate act of manipulation? With her thoughts racing, Evelyn carefully placed the letter back with the others, and stood up, making her way back to the village hall. The quiet hum of the village hall seemed oddly tense as she entered. A small crowd of villagers had gathered around the historical display, murmuring amongst themselves. As they parted to make way for her, Evelyn's gaze fell upon the missing wedding photograph that had mysteriously returned to its rightful place. But something was terribly wrong. The groom's face had been crudely scratched out, leaving only a blank silhouette in the otherwise perfect image. Evelyn studied the defaced photograph, her sharp eyes noting the jagged lines and the deliberate force behind them. This was no act of random vandalism. This was personal. Whoever had done this had gone to great lengths to erase the groom from the memory of that day, almost as if they wanted to erase his very existence. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the depth of the malice at play. In St. Mary, such open acts of aggression were rare. The villagers prided themselves on their polite civility, always keeping their darker emotions buried beneath a veneer of good manners. But now the tension in the air was palpable, and Evelyn couldn't help but wonder what lengths these people were willing to go to in order to bury the secrets of the past. She recalled the record she had found earlier: the cancelled wedding license, the forged letter, the scandalous whispers that had followed the bride and groom long after their wedding day. Each piece of the puzzle was falling into place, but the more Evelyn uncovered, the more questions arose. What had really happened that day? Who had been the true architect of the tragedy? And more importantly, what were they still hiding? The haunting silence of the village pressed in on her as Evelyn walked away from the display, her mind racing with the possibilities. One thing was certain: the truth was buried deep, and the darker forces at play were far from finished. Miss Marple stood quietly before the defaced photograph, her eyes scanning the cruel slash that had erased the groom's features, leaving nothing but a distorted shadow. The simple image, once a symbol of love and unity, had now become an eerie reminder of the bitterness that had haunted the two families for years. The act was not just an attempt to obscure his identity. It was an ominous message, a direct challenge to those who dared recall the true events of 1923. It was a deliberate effort to bury the past, to erase the groom from memory, as though his very existence was the source of all the darkness that had plagued the village. Miss Marple's mind churned with the implications. The focus on the groom's likeness, the harshness of the marks, suggested a personal vendetta. Someone was trying to make sure that the groom's name would never be spoken again. Yet the bride's image remained untouched, preserved as though held in some sacred reverence, untouched by the defacer's fury. Why? The contrast was striking, and the answer became clear to Miss Marple. This wasn't just about the groom. It was about ensuring that the man behind the wedding, his sins, his secrets, would remain buried, his name removed from history as if he had never existed. This defaced image was a warning, a cryptic message only a few could understand. The same hand that had written the forged letter, an attempt to tear apart the bride's world, was now behind the defacing of this photograph. The same hand, no doubt, held a grudge so deep that it sought to rewrite history itself. The groom was not merely a man. He had become a symbol of unresolved conflict, the embodiment of betrayal and disgrace that could never be allowed to fade into memory. The bitterness between the two families, once simmering quietly beneath the surface, had now boiled over into an all-out war, one where old wounds were being reopened, and fresh scars carved into the fabric of the village's story. Miss Marple could almost hear the whispered accusations and resentments that had been passed down through the years, each generation adding another layer of bitterness to the tale. As she stood there, lost in her thoughts, she realized the defaced photograph was more than just a symbol of hatred. It was a clue, an accusation wrapped in silence, a triumph for the one who had orchestrated it. This was a calculated move, a warning that the secrets of the past were still very much alive, and that someone was determined to ensure they remained hidden. The photograph had done its job, reminding the villagers that some truths were too dangerous to uncover. Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery pressing upon her. The wedding had never come to pass, the bride had fled, and the groom's face was now erased from history. But these were just the surface details. The real story, the tangled web of lies, revenge and unspoken truths remained just out of reach. As she made her way back home, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that she had only scratched the surface of something far deeper. She had uncovered a forged letter that had torn apart a wedding, and a photograph that had obliterated a man's legacy. But the truth behind these acts was far more intricate, more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The secrets of the past were not simply buried, they were carefully guarded, and those who sought to uncover them would have to contend with forces far more powerful than they could anticipate. As the evening drew near, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to her next step. She knew how to unravel secrets. She had done it countless times before. The key was patience, persistence, and knowing exactly where to look. And sometimes, a cup of tea and a friendly chat were all that was needed to loosen even the most tightly held secrets. With that in mind, she made her way to the home of the bride's sister, knowing full well that the next piece of the puzzle lay within the walls of that house. With her usual gentle smile, Miss Marple knocked on the door, prepared to unearth more layers of the mystery. For in St. Mary's, as in most quiet villages, there was always more to the story than met the eye, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The sister, pale and drawn from the weight of recent events, accepted Miss Marple's offer of a friendly cup of tea, though a flicker of unease passed through her eyes, a subtle admission of something left unsaid. The quiet clink of teacups filled the room as Miss Marple settled into the parlor, her keen gaze studying the sister's every movement. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, and Miss Marple, as always, was patient, waiting for the truth to emerge. With a gentle nudge, she steered the conversation toward the wedding that had never come to pass, choosing her words with care. The sister's fingers tightened around the delicate china, her knuckles blanching as she struggled to maintain composure. In a tremulous voice, she finally spoke, revealing that there was something terrible about the groom, something buried so deep that had it been exposed, it would have destroyed him entirely. Her words trembled with the weight of the secret, and though they were vague, they carried an unmistakable aura of scandal, a whisper of something dark that had never been meant for anyone's ears. Miss Marple listened attentively, her calm demeanor unshaken. She noticed the sister's reluctance to offer names or specifics, her reluctance to fully unfold the layers of this hidden transgression. The emotions that flickered in the sister's eyes, fear, guilt, and shame, spoke volumes. This was no simple tale of a broken promise. The truth beneath was far more insidious, a secret powerful enough to ruin lives if it fell into the wrong hands. As the sister hesitated, her voice faltering under the weight of her confession, Miss Marple offered a few kind words of reassurance, knowing that the truth she was inching toward was far more tangled and dangerous than it appeared. The sister insisted vehemently that she had shared the secret with no one, her tone rising slightly with the denial. But Miss Marple was sharp enough to catch the subtle shifts in her posture. The sister's hand trembled slightly as she set the teacup down too hastily, and a faint flush crept up her neck, an involuntary sign of her discomfort. And then, like an unnoticed slip, the sister let a detail fall from her lips, an offhand mention of something from that day in the vest. It was a brief phrase, barely noticeable, but in that instant, the truth nearly slipped free, like a shadow escaping the grasp of daylight. The sister immediately caught herself, pressing her lips together as if to seal the words back inside. But the damage was done, the sudden cessation of speech, the trembling hands. It was all there for Miss Marple to see. The sister may have believed she had hidden the secret well, but her unconscious movements betrayed her. A crack had appeared in the carefully constructed lie, she told herself, a glimpse into a truth she had been too afraid to face. Miss Marple's gaze lowered to her knitting, her mind racing as she made a mental note to probe deeper into the sister's slip. It was subtle, yet telling. This wasn't just a story the sister was trying to hide from others. It was a lie she had come to believe herself, a lie so deeply entrenched in her own mind that she couldn't fully see how much of it had already unraveled. Miss Marple knew that the next step in this investigation would require patience and careful observation. The thread of truth had been revealed, but it was tangled in a web of guilt, fear, and deceit, and Miss Marple was determined to follow it, no matter where it led. With a quiet, knowing smile, she leaned back in her chair, allowing the silence to stretch, waiting for the sister to reveal more, or perhaps for her to retreat further into the shadows of her own conscience. In the end, it was clear to Miss Marple. The past had a way of asserting itself, and the truth once revealed was never easily forgotten. Still troubled by the sister's cryptic admission, Miss Marple felt an undeniable pull toward the old church, a place steeped in the quiet whispers of village secrets. As she entered, the faint smell of aged wood and incense filled the air, the silence of the building heavy with the weight of countless untold stories. She sought out the elderly verger, a man who had faithfully served the church for decades, his memory growing patchy with age, but still sharp enough to recall moments others had long since forgotten. The verger fumbled with a heavy ring of keys before reluctantly agreeing to speak, his gaze clouded with uncertainty. He confessed to remembering something strange about the morning of the ill-fated wedding. There had been raised voices near the vestry, hushed yet urgently intense, enough to cause the verger to pause in his duties. Though he had not seen the participants, one voice stood out clearly, the groom's, filled with a tension that spoke of confrontation. The other voice, however, was a mystery to him. It had not belonged to any of the usual parishioners, nor was it the voice of the bride's father. It had sounded unfamiliar, unsettling, like the presence of someone who did not belong in the familiar setting of the church. The verger's account was fragmented, filled with half-finished thoughts and vague impressions, but Miss Marple was quick to connect the dots. This argument, she realized, had likely occurred just before the bride had fled. The discovery of the groom's hidden transgression had set in motion a confrontation, one that could have escalated into a far more dangerous scenario. Was the unknown man part of this growing web of deceit? Had someone else learned of the groom's dark secret, and seen it as leverage for their own gain? With a quiet word of thanks, Miss Marple left the church, her mind whirring with the implications of what she had just learned. The new information fit together like pieces of a puzzle, revealing a far deeper and more complex conspiracy than she had initially suspected. Walking slowly back through the village, Miss Marple pondered how the events had unfolded. What had initially seemed like a simple tale of a heartbroken bride fleeing from the altar was quickly morphing into something much darker. The bride's flight had not been the result of a singular betrayal. It was part of a larger, far-reaching drama that had been set in motion long before she ever reached the church. If the sister had truly kept the secret to herself, it meant that someone else had acted on this dangerous knowledge without her direct involvement. Perhaps someone had overheard her slip of the tongue, or had deduced the truth for themselves. The confrontation in the vestry, Miss Marple now realized, was not a spontaneous outburst. It had been part of a plan, a prelude to the chaos that would follow. This revelation cast the bride's disappearance in an entirely new light. It was no longer just a desperate escape from heartbreak. It was the culmination of a web of deceit, manipulation and hidden threats, all converging on that fateful day. Each piece of the puzzle, every whispered conversation, every hidden gesture, was now falling into place, and Miss Marple knew that the truth behind this tangled mystery was far darker and more intricate than anyone in the village had dared to imagine. The mystery, once simple and straightforward, was now a labyrinth of secrets that twisted and turned with every new clue she uncovered, and she was determined to follow it to the very end, wherever it might lead. As the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, Miss Marple found herself drawn into the complex web of secrets that had surrounded the fateful wedding day. It became increasingly clear that the disappearance of the bride was no simple accident or runaway bride scenario. It had been the result of careful manipulation, expertly engineered by someone with a hidden agenda. The carefully crafted façade of a tragic love story hid something far darker beneath. The bride's sister, who had unknowingly played a crucial role in this drama, wasn't merely harboring a scandal. She had become a pawn in a much larger and far more dangerous game. Her knowledge of the groom's secret had been weaponized, turning her into a reluctant protector of a truth that could destroy everything if revealed. At first, Miss Marple had wondered if the sister's silence was simply a matter of loyalty, perhaps trying to shield the groom or someone else from the consequences of a shameful act. But as the details of the case unfolded, it became evident that this silence was a result of much more fear. The fear that someone with a great deal of power, had learned about the groom's dark secret, and had used it as leverage, forcing the sister into complicity. The manipulation was subtle, almost invisible, but devastating nonetheless. Miss Marple's sharp instincts told her that the sister's silence wasn't voluntary. It was a prison she had unwittingly entered, and now, years later, she was trapped in her own silence. By withholding the truth, the sister had given someone the ability to exploit her knowledge, turning it into a tool for their own ends. But Miss Marple also saw the tragic irony of the situation. If the sister had spoken, if she had dared to break the silence, she would have been forced to betray the very person she had hoped to protect. It was a cruel twist of fate that had burdened the sister with a guilt she had carried for years. Miss Marple could feel the weight of it, the torment that had been eating away at the sister's conscience every single day since that tragic event. But now, with each passing clue, Miss Marple understood that the key to unlocking this mystery lay in finding the one who had manipulated the sister's silence. Someone had been hiding in the shadows, pulling the strings all along. A person who had stood just out of sight, watching as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Miss Marple was determined to find that hidden figure, no matter the risks involved. The recent discovery of the bride's unexpected return to the village sent ripples through the tightly knit community, shaking the very foundations of what everyone had believed to be true. For decades, her disappearance had been a haunting mystery, the subject of whispered conversations, rumors, and speculation. No one truly believed she would return. After all, the wedding had taken place years ago, and her sudden departure had left only a trail of confusion and unspoken questions in its wake. The villagers had grown accustomed to the idea that the bride was lost forever to the annals of history, a ghost of the past that haunted their collective memory. And yet there she was, standing on Miss Marple's doorstep one quiet afternoon, a shadow of the young woman she had once been. Her once vibrant presence was now a distant memory, replaced by a woman whose posture seemed weighed down by years of regret and sorrow. Her voice, when it emerged from her lips, was little more than a soft whisper, barely audible against the soft rustle of the wind. The very sight of her was enough to send shockwaves through the village, stirring up emotions that had long been buried under layers of time. The villagers, who had long regarded her as little more than a myth, were now faced with the truth of her existence. The once youthful bride, forever frozen in the memories of those who had known her, was now a broken, weathered figure. Miss Marple could feel the intensity of the atmosphere shift as she looked at the woman standing before her. There was an air of unease about her, an indefinable tension that made it clear that her return was no simple reconciliation. There was more to this than just a reunion. It felt like a reckoning. The woman was no longer the bright-eyed bride-to-be, but a woman whose presence was heavy with unspoken truths, Miss Marple took a step back, her mind racing as she processed the implications of the woman's return. The mystery surrounding her disappearance had deepened. What had truly driven the bride to leave all those years ago? What had kept her away for so long? And why had she returned now? Every instinct told Miss Marple that this was no coincidence. The timing of her arrival was too deliberate, the woman's presence too fraught with meaning. The secrets that had been buried all these years were beginning to rise to the surface, and Miss Marple knew that she was standing at the precipice of something far more dangerous than she had ever anticipated. The bride's return had cast the entire case in a new light, raising more questions than answers. Who was she protecting? What was the true reason behind her disappearance? And most chillingly, had she returned to reveal the truth, or to bury it forever? These questions swirled in Miss Marple's mind as she braced herself for the revelation that was sure to come. The stakes had never been higher, and the path forward was shrouded in even more mystery than before. What she didn't yet know, but would soon uncover, was that the final truth would change everything. Nothing would ever be the same again. The woman standing in front of Miss Marple was unmistakably the bride who had vanished on her wedding day, the one whose absence had haunted the village of St. Mary for decades. Her reappearance, at first almost unthinkable, now demanded an explanation, yet none came. Her eyes, once filled with the youthful optimism of a bride-to-be, were now dulled by sorrow. Her gaze heavy as if burdened with years of hardship. Time had left its mark on her, and the weight of the years seemed to have worn her down, each day in exile like an unrelenting tide that gradually eroded her once vibrant spirit. Miss Marple, with her usual grace, offered no sign of surprise, only an unflappable courtesy that had become her signature. Beneath her calm demeanor, however, a growing sense of unease began to stir. The bride's presence in her home, after all these years, could not be mere coincidence. Miss Marple greeted her with a gentleness that masked the questions swirling in her mind. The bride made no attempt to explain her return, or offer any comfort to ease the tension in the room. Instead, her words came out haltingly, as if each one was a struggle, a piece of a larger puzzle she couldn't yet bring herself to solve. She requested only one thing: to rest. Her voice trembled, and it was as if she herself were a stranger to the life she once knew, a visitor in her own history. It was clear that something had forced her to return, something in the present had dug up the past, dragging it back to the surface with brutal inevitability. Without question, Miss Marple set about serving tea, her movements deliberate, her gaze never leaving the bride's frail hands. The bride's fingers clutched the teacup, as though it were a lifeline, a fragile connection to a reality she wasn't sure she could hold on to. Miss Marple noted the tremor in the woman's hands, and the subtle way her posture sagged, betraying the weight of her burdens. There was something haunting in the way the bride's eyes flickered towards the door, as though she half expected someone to appear, someone who had been a part of this intricate web of secrets she had come to confront. Miss Marple's patience was legendary. She did not press, she listened carefully, letting the silence stretch between them as she served the tea. She knew from experience that some truths could not be forced, they had to be coaxed out gently, with time. But the more she listened, the more she sensed the deep, simmering dread that clung to the bride like a shadow. Every word she spoke was laden with a mixture of regret and fear. She spoke vaguely, hinting at an unresolved matter, a confrontation she had avoided for too long. But each sentence trailed off, leaving a void that felt as cold and empty as the spaces in the bride's heart. It was in these silences that the true story began to reveal itself. The bride's face, pale and drawn, became an open book, her expressions betraying a deep, unspoken fear whenever certain names were mentioned. Her eyes darted away, a flicker of panic crossing her features when Miss Marple's questions veered too close to the heart of the matter. The bride's refusal to speak plainly was not just a matter of hesitation. It was as though there was something in the room, something unseen and ever-present, that held her captive, preventing her from voicing the truth. Miss Marple's intuition sharpened, and she recognized the signs of a woman haunted by a secret she could no longer keep buried. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy, thick with the unspoken weight of years spent in hiding. Fear not just of the past, but of what might be lurking in the present, seemed to coil around the bride's thoughts like a serpent, choking off the words she longed to say. Despite the emotional barricades the bride had constructed around herself, Miss Marple knew that the woman's silence was not simply about protecting someone else. It was about her own fear of facing the truth, a fear so profound that it had kept her away for so long. As the conversation drifted on, Miss Marple's mind began to piece together the puzzle. The bride had returned to confront something, to finally face the ghosts of her past, but she was terrified of what that confrontation might mean. The room seemed to close in on them, the ticking of the clock in the corner loud in the otherwise heavy silence. Each moment stretched longer, thicker, as though time itself was holding its breath. Miss Marple did not press further, understanding that some wounds were too fresh to reveal all at once. But in her heart, she knew that the true mystery lay not in the bride's disappearance, but in the dark and tangled threads that had led her to return. What had she been running from? And more importantly, why had she chosen this moment of all moments to confront it? The bride's visit, once a seemingly simple return to a forgotten past, was quickly becoming something much more dangerous. And Miss Marple, as always, stood at the edge of that mystery, ready to step into the unknown and discover the truth, no matter how dark or unsettling it might be. Miss Marple understood the delicate nature of the moment. It was better to let the bride speak when the time was right, allowing the sorrow and anxiety etched in her features to guide the pacing of her confession. Yet the weight of the bride's unspoken words pressed on the air, as though something dire clung to her like a shadow. Miss Marple knew that the truth had to emerge, and it was only a matter of time. Despite her usual patience, there was an unspoken urgency in the air, one that Miss Marple could not ignore. The bride's eyes held a silent plea, an appeal for understanding, and the trembling tone of her voice only deepened the mystery. Every word seemed to hold back more than it revealed, as if a storm was brewing within her, held back by an invisible force. It took a second cup of tea, and a gentle reassurance from Miss Marple that no judgments would be passed before the bride's confession began to slip out. And when it did, it came as a shock. Blackmail. She uttered the word with a shudder, her voice breaking as though it was too vile to speak aloud. The very mention of it sent a chill through the room, making the air feel heavier, laden with the implication of something sinister. Someone had been threatening her, demanding money, or worse, silence, in exchange for keeping a secret she couldn't yet name. The bride refused to divulge the identity of the blackmailer, her face tightening in fear at the very thought. She claimed it would be far too dangerous to speak their name, as though doing so would unleash something terrible. A tremor of panic flickered across her face, and she glanced nervously towards the door, as though expecting someone to burst in at any moment and silence her confession before it could fully take form. It was clear that her terror was not just rooted in private shame. There was something darker at play. A sense of menace hung in the air, and Miss Marple's practiced eyes caught every subtle detail. The bride's quick, furtive glances, the tightness in her voice, the unspoken fear that hung like a cloud around her words. Was the bride protecting the blackmailer, or was she protecting herself from them? The bride's words, though laden with fear, offered no clarity. They only added new layers of doubt, each one as heavy as the last. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the fragility of the human spirit, let her speak as much or as little as she wished, choosing not to press but to listen carefully to the tremors in her voice. In her mind, Miss Marple catalogued every nuance, every half-formed sentence, every tightening of the grip on the teacup, every fleeting moment when the bride's eyes flickered towards the window, as if she longed to flee, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. As word of the bride's return spread through the village, it stirred up a storm of gossip, shifting the atmosphere like a sudden change in the weather. Some villagers, unable to contain their curiosity, openly stared at her as she passed by, their eyes filled with unspoken questions. Others pretended to offer polite greetings, but their whispered conversations behind gloved hands betrayed their true thoughts. They looked over their shoulders as though expecting a scandal to erupt at any moment. The air was thick with the anticipation of something unknown, something ominous that hung over the village like a dark cloud. Miss Marple, ever the observant one, walked with the bride a few times, noting the subtle shifts in her demeanor with every passing encounter. The villagers' reactions were telling. Some greeted the bride with genuine concern, their expressions a mixture of relief and uncertainty. It was as though they didn't know whether to rejoice in her return or dread the storm that she might bring with her. Each interaction, each look cast in her direction, seemed to add more layers to the mystery. What had happened to the bride all those years ago? Why had she left, and what was it that brought her back now, after so many years in hiding? Miss Marple knew that the answers were buried deep within the bride's past, answers that she would uncover, no matter how dark or dangerous the truth might be. The bride's return had set the wheels of fate in motion, and Miss Marple was determined to follow the threads wherever they led, knowing that the final revelation would shake the very foundations of the village. The old stories of the village had begun to stir again, and as they spread, more than one face bore the strain of private worry. The reappearance of the bride, once at the center of a scandal, clearly threatened the carefully curated reputations of several residents. Their composure faltered just enough to reveal the depth of their concern, as if the mere mention of her name could unravel the secrets they had spent years burying. Yet, through all this, the bride remained uneasy, her every furtive glance betraying the weight of her past. She had once been the epicenter of a storm, and now, that storm seemed poised to return, with even greater force. Each passing day, as the villagers whispered behind closed doors, the sense of impending disaster grew stronger. Miss Marple, ever observant, noticed the bride's tense posture, and the subtle signs of distress that marred her otherwise composed demeanor. In her usual gentle manner, Miss Marple reassured her, offering words of comfort, but beneath the kindness of her tone was a steely resolve, a determination to uncover who else might be terrified of the bride's testimony and why. The old woman was no fool. There were deeper currents at play, and she intended to find out who was being swept along by them. That evening, alone in her home, Miss Marple pondered the bride's anxious confession. The mention of blackmail had sent a ripple of unease through her, but it was the bride's unspoken fears, the things she couldn't or wouldn't name, that gnawed at Miss Marple's mind. As the hours passed, Miss Marple replayed every word, every pause in the bride's story, as though each fragment held the key to something far more sinister. It was clear now, the blackmail was just the surface, something far darker lurked beneath, an intricate web of secrets, deceit and fear. Miss Marple remembered the way certain villagers had reacted when they first saw the bride. Surprise. Yes, but there was more. Alarm, real palpable fear. The kind of fear that suggested the blackmail was simply a tool, a smokescreen, meant to cover up an even more dangerous secret that had been festering for years. The bride, Miss Marple realized, wasn't just afraid to name names. No, there was something more, something that made her hesitate. The tension in her voice, the fear that seemed to rise unbidden at the mere thought of revealing the truth, hinted at something deeper. Miss Marple's mind began to connect the dots. Victim and villain might be bound by a shared history, one too dangerous to expose. The old detective set aside her knitting, her mind shifting gears. There was a quiet, but determined purpose now guiding her thoughts. If the bride had returned to confront someone, it was likely that the blackmail was merely a tactic, a last-ditch effort to bury the sins of the past. Miss Marple had a sense that the final pieces were falling into place, and that the endgame was drawing nearer. Secrets buried for so long had a way of resurfacing, but not without bringing reckoning with them. And Miss Marple would be there when it happened. The next day, Miss Marple returned to the late guest's room, pretending to tidy up and offer her usual condolences to anyone who might be present. But her true purpose was far more specific. She was after something she had seen before, the flower. It had been pressed carefully within an old book, its petals flattened with time, yet still vibrant, still holding secrets of its own. Miss Marple's keen eye had noticed it during a previous visit, and she knew it was no mere trinket. No, this flower was a symbol, a clue that would lead her closer to the truth. Something important, something tied to the bride's past, was hidden within it, and Miss Marple intended to find it. Kneeling beside the small bedside table, Miss Marple took a closer look at the delicate flower. It wasn't just a keepsake. It was a clue, placed with deliberate intention. Its petals, once vibrant, had now faded, hinting at the passage of time and the significance it held. As her fingers brushed over its soft edges, Miss Marple noted the faint speckles of color, like a remnant of a once lush bloom that had been pressed carefully, perhaps to preserve a memory. What truly caught her attention was the angle at which the stem had been clipped, almost too perfectly, as if it had been cut from a larger arrangement, with precision. This wasn't the work of someone casually preserving a flower. No, this was a purposeful act. She recalled the moment when the police had first scoured the room, dismissing the flower as nothing more than a sentimental trinket, something left behind with no real meaning. But Miss Marple, who had spent her life paying attention to the smallest details, knew better. People didn't press flowers without reason. They did it to hold on to something precious, to keep a moment alive, or perhaps to commemorate something deeply personal. The way the flower had been placed so carefully, tucked open on a page of a book, suggested it hadn't been left by the deceased man himself. No, someone had wanted him to see it, someone who hoped it would stir a memory best left undisturbed. Her mind raced as she gently closed the book and stored the observation in her thoughts. If this flower had been placed with such care, it might hold the key to understanding why the deceased had become so entwined in the village's troubled history. Miss Marple left the guest's room, but her thoughts lingered on the wedding, the silent event that had haunted the village for years. It was as if the memories of that day were wrapped in shadows, waiting to resurface. The bride had carried a bouquet similar to this one. It was filled with blossoms that symbolized hope and unity, the very things that had seemed so fragile in that moment of uncertainty. Among those flowers had been this exact specimen, its distinct shape and subtle fragrance fresh in Miss Marple's memory. She rarely forgot such details, for she knew that the smallest recollections often carried the most weight, the most significance. The bride, youthful and full of expectation, had clutched that bouquet as though it was her shield against the gossip and bitterness of family feuds and long-held grudges. But when the bride disappeared, it wasn't just her absence that sent ripples through the village. It was the discovery of a few wilted petals in the churchyard. Those petals were a silent warning to those who believed in the power of superstition. They seemed like an omen, an unsettling sign that something terrible had transpired. And now, with the reappearance of the bride, and this strange flower, Miss Marple felt the pieces of a much larger puzzle falling into place. There was more to this mystery than anyone had realized. Something dangerous, something hidden for far too long, was about to come to light, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the pressed flower in her hand, a sense of certainty gripping her heart. This was no mere trinket. This was a deliberate symbol, and as soon as her fingers brushed its delicate petals, she felt a jolt of realization. History was indeed repeating itself, but in a far more sinister guise. Why had someone chosen this particular flower? It was the same variety carried by the bride on that fateful day, a day marked by heartbreak, betrayal and unspeakable secrets. The question that now haunted Miss Marple was whether this flower was a warning, a silent reproach aimed at those who had been too eager to forget the past, or whether it was a desperate call to reckon with the sins that had never truly been put to rest. In the quiet of her mind, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to reflect. In a village as small as this, objects like flowers, photographs, and even old letters were never as insignificant as they seemed. Each one carried a deeper story, a thread woven into the fabric of history, and only the sharpest minds could uncover the truth hidden within. Her instincts told her that this flower, so carefully preserved, held the key to understanding something far darker, something that had been buried for far too long. Driven by an insistent nudge of her memory, Miss Marple began quietly inquiring among the older residents, hoping to learn more about the significance of the flower. It didn't take long before one of them, leaning in with a conspiratorial air, finally shared a secret that had been whispered for decades. The flower, it seemed, had once been part of a secret lover's gift, a token given to someone in the wedding party, a forbidden gesture that spoke volumes. The revelation struck a nerve. igniting a series of tragic events that no one had dared speak of since. The villager, lowering their voice to a near whisper, recounted how this single flower had sparked an affair hidden beneath the veneer of respectability. It had symbolized a love that could not be, a romance that had been in direct opposition to the union the bride and groom were supposed to celebrate. As the truth of this illicit relationship slowly crept into the light, it caused a scandal so profound that it not only tainted the wedding, but also dragged both families into a web of shame from which they had never fully recovered. To this day the villagers spoke of the events in hushed tones, unwilling to acknowledge the raw, ugly truth that had been exposed that day. But now, after all these years, the same flower had reappeared, this time at the scene of a death. A cold shiver ran down Miss Marple's spine. If this flower was indeed connected to the long-buried affair, then someone had resurrected the darkest corners of the past, ensuring that old wounds would be reopened, that the family secrets would bleed again. Miss Marple's mind raced as she contemplated the implications. The flower was not a mere memento, or a sentimental token. No, it was a message, deliberately placed to confront its recipient with the ghosts of the past. The question now was who had placed it, and what did they want? With each passing moment, the puzzle pieces began to fit into place, and Miss Marple could feel the threads of a far-reaching conspiracy unraveling before her eyes. The old village secrets were coming to light, and she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how dark or dangerous it might be. Miss Marple's mind raced as she pieced together the events surrounding the pressed flower. The man's untimely death weighed heavily on her thoughts. She was certain that the flower had been placed just before the tragedy, its presence a chilling reminder of the tangled web of secrets he had been caught in. She could almost picture the moment when he first laid eyes on it, a fleeting shiver of recognition running through him as he grasped the significance. Perhaps in that moment, he realized the inescapable truth: the past was closing in on him, and there was no escape from the dark history he had tried so hard to bury. Had he tried to silence the haunting revelations tied to that scandalous bloom? Or had he been the one threatened by it, the bearer of secrets too dangerous to remain hidden? Miss Marple's sharp intuition told her that in cases like these, the line between the living and the dead was often more blurred than anyone cared to admit. It was as though the victim, in his final moments, had been complicit in the unearthing of truths that had long been buried. Whether he had been a willing participant in reopening those old wounds, or an unfortunate bystander swept into the resurgence of those haunting memories, one thing was certain: the flower was more than a simple memento. It was a message, a silent herald of confrontation, one that spoke louder than words ever could. As she stepped outside, the cool air filled her lungs, and her mind continued to churn with possibilities. The circle of those who could know both the significance of the flower and the dark secret it symbolized was small. Most of the younger villagers were oblivious to the scandal that had rocked the community all those years ago. But the older ones, those who had lived through the turmoil, knew well the power that the wedding had carried. And some of them had no doubt passed the story down through whispers, perhaps not fully understanding its depth but aware of the raw emotion tied to it. Miss Marple narrowed her focus. Those closest to the ill-fated wedding, the bride, the groom's mother, the bride's sister, and a handful of others involved in the ceremony, were the ones who could have intimate knowledge of both the floral details and the devastating secret that had unfolded that day. Each of them had a reason to want that past buried, or perhaps in some cases to bring it back to light. The flower's reappearance was not a coincidence. It was a sign that the darkest parts of the wedding scandal could no longer remain dormant, and someone, somewhere, had decided it was time for those old wounds to bleed again. As Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the bride, the figure who had recently returned to the village, bearing the weight of so many unspoken truths, she couldn't help but wonder what role she played in this unfolding drama. How much did she know about the significance of that flower? Had she come back to uncover the long-buried secret, or was she merely trying to keep it locked away, just as it had been all those years ago? Miss Marple's grip on her handbag tightened as she walked with purpose, the mystery taking form in her mind, piece by piece. She was getting closer to the truth, petal by petal, and she was determined to see it revealed in its full devastating light. Despite knowing how thorny the path might be, Miss Marple had carefully orchestrated the gathering, inviting all the key players back to the village hall. She framed it as a simple event, a final opportunity for reflection, a chance to recreate the wedding toast in a more subdued setting. The gathering was meant to trigger memories, to gently stir the quiet recollections of those who had lived through the scandalous day. Yet beneath the calm exterior, Miss Marple knew that the true purpose was far more profound, to uncover what had been buried, what had been silenced by the passage of time. It was a quiet affair, almost too calm for such a weighty moment. The hall itself, though unchanged in its essence, felt like a relic of the past, its once vibrant memories now softened by the years of neglect and the inevitable fading of time. Dust clung to the old wooden beams, and the air felt heavy with the weight of forgotten truths. As the last few guests trickled in, Miss Marple observed their discomfort, each person's hesitancy palpable. Some walked with an almost calculated composure, their faces a mask of indifference, while others seemed physically unsettled by the sheer force of their return. Could they still feel the ghosts of that day? Was the past lingering too close to the present for them to comfortably ignore? Whatever the reason, Miss Marple was undeterred. She knew that no matter how much time had passed, the secrets buried in this room weren't locked away in the dusty corners. They were alive, hanging in the air, just waiting for the right moment to be unearthed. Standing at the front of the room, Miss Marple surveyed the gathering with her keen eyes. She felt the subtle tension that rippled through the room as the guests took their seats. There was a quiet sense of anticipation that no one was willing to acknowledge. But Miss Marple could sense it. Something was about to break free. The air itself seemed to hum with the energy of impending revelation. The time for silence had ended. The toast began with all the usual politeness, the exchange of pleasantries, the hollow laughter, the smiles that only partially concealed the deeper emotions simmering just beneath the surface. Miss Marple carefully led the toast, her voice steady, but her eyes sharp, taking in every reaction, every nuance. The reactions were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet Miss Marple caught every shift, every flinch, and every tightened jaw. The bride's father was mentioned first, a name spoken softly, almost reverently, as one speaks of the deceased, though he had been gone for years. It was a delicate moment, but it carried a weight of unresolved grief that none of the guests could entirely dismiss. Then came the groom's mother. Her hand trembled slightly around her glass, and Miss Marple noticed how her knuckles went white, her lips pressed together so tightly that they seemed to be holding back more than just words. Her discomfort was unmistakable. Miss Marple studied her closely, knowing that behind that facade of composure, something was churning beneath the surface, something that the woman had tried for so long to keep hidden. But it was the bride's sister who caught Miss Marple's attention most of all. The moment her name was mentioned, the woman's gaze shifted away, as though she could not bear to be in the same room with the memories attached to it. She did not simply look away. It was as if she was attempting to physically distance herself from the very words, from the very history that those words conjured. The tension in the room thickened with each passing second, and Miss Marple could almost feel the web of lies and secrets tightening around them. The toast continued, but to Miss Marple, it felt like a performance, a charade. Each name, each carefully crafted sentence, seemed to unearth more than just the past. It seemed to crack open the layers of deceit that had been carefully constructed over the years. The mask of politeness was slipping, and beneath it lay the raw, uncomfortable truths that no one was ready to face. But Miss Marple had prepared herself for this. She knew that the final revelations would not come easily, but they would come. The time had come for the past to speak, and she was ready to listen. The bride's sister, hands clenched tightly in her lap, refused to lift her eyes from the floor when the father's name was spoken. It was the smallest of gestures, but to Miss Marple, it was everything. It wasn't just avoidance. It was the quiet acknowledgement of a truth long suppressed, a truth that had haunted them all. As the names continued to surface, so too did the reactions, flickers of discomfort, sharp inhales, and barely concealed gasps. It wasn't the jovial atmosphere Miss Marple had expected. It was an unraveling. The faces in the room, each one so familiar, yet now eerily distant, gave away more than they could hide. This was not a simple reunion of kin. It was the gathering of ghosts, long-buried secrets threatening to rise once more. Miss Marple absorbed each subtle movement, each twitch and tremor. These were not just the markers of a family reunion. They were the cracks in a façade built over years of deceit, long forgotten but never entirely erased. As the evening waned, Miss Marple waited until the final sip of wine was taken, the last clink of glasses echoing in the room, marking the end of their shallow toasts. Then, with a voice as gentle as a breeze, she spoke, her words cutting through the stillness like a blade. "The bride's father," she said softly, her gaze never wavering, "did not die as you all believed. He faked his death many years ago, after discovering a betrayal so deep, so insidious, that it involved his very family." A ripple of shock passed through the room, though it was quickly silenced by the calm authority of Miss Marple's raised hand. Her next words seemed to float in the air between them, each one a thread pulling them deeper into the tangled web of deception. "The betrayal," she continued, her tone still light but charged with quiet menace, had been buried, carefully concealed beneath layers of feigned grief and manufactured mourning. The room held its breath as Miss Marple paused, taking in the varying reactions. Some guests were visibly stunned, their faces pale, eyes wide with disbelief. Others, however, were much harder to read, slightly shifting in their seats, barely containing their unease. But it was the bride's sister that Miss Marple focused on, watching the twitch of her fingers, the tightness in her jaw. Her shock was far from controlled. It was a carefully crafted performance, a mask cracking under the pressure. Then there was the groom's mother, who turned a shade paler with each passing word, her face drained of color, her breath shallow as if the weight of Miss Marple's revelation was too much to bear. It was clear now. This was no accident. The father's disappearance was part of an intricate cover-up, a carefully orchestrated conspiracy, designed to make the world believe he was dead. But Miss Marple, with all her years of keen observation, knew that in this village, truth had a way of clawing its way back to the surface, no matter how deep it was buried. Her voice remained steady, almost motherly, as she continued. "The guest who passed away," Miss Marple said, her words soft but sharp, had been blackmailing the father for years. This blackmailer's power did not lie in wealth, but in something far more dangerous: knowledge. Knowledge of the father's survival, and the truth of the betrayal, that no one dared speak of until now. A hush fell over the room, the air thick with anticipation. The ghostly secrets of the past were no longer just whispers, they were truths demanding to be heard. Each word Miss Marple spoke added another piece to the puzzle, slowly revealing the hidden twisted connections that had bound these people together, in ways they had never anticipated. The real story was just beginning, and Miss Marple, ever the orchestrator, had only begun to pull the strings. A chill spread across the room as Miss Marple's words sank in. The revelation that the deceased guest had once held the power to ruin lives sent a wave of silent panic through the gathered family. He hadn't been a mere stranger, nor an unwelcome outsider. He had been a shadow, a master manipulator, weaving a dangerous web of control. He had used his knowledge of the family's darkest secrets as leverage, threatening to destroy reputations, unravel lives, and expose hidden betrayals. But now, Miss Marple realized, the true horror wasn't just the blackmail, it was the fact that this man had been silenced before he could finish his task. Why? Why was he killed before revealing the full extent of the secrets he held? The weight of the question hung heavily in the air, and Miss Marple took a moment, letting the tension simmer, before continuing. Her keen eyes never left the bride's sister, who was now trembling, clutching her handkerchief so tightly, it was a wonder it didn't tear. Her eyes flitted nervously around the room, as though the walls themselves might crumble and bury them all in their buried truths. But Miss Marple wasn't finished yet. There was one final piece to the puzzle that would expose everything. As the air grew thick with anticipation, Miss Marple revealed the most shocking truth of all. The toast, the seemingly innocent toast made decades ago during a joyful family celebration, was not just a toast. No, it had been a carefully crafted coded message, a silent threat designed to warn the groom's father of the consequences of his actions. This was no simple gesture of goodwill. It was a pointed accusation, a trap hidden in plain sight, meant to expose the guilt that had plagued the groom's father for years. Miss Marple explained how, upon discovering the unimaginable betrayal, the father had been so horrified, so consumed with rage, that he had orchestrated his own disappearance. He left behind a fractured family, one torn apart by lies, secrets, and untold truths. Yet, in that one toast, he had unknowingly set the stage for his own unraveling. What had been perceived as a light-hearted moment had in fact been a message laden with heavy meaning, a message that the family had been too naive to understand at the time. Now, as Miss Marple's words sank deeper, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The guests who once sat at ease, now fidgeted nervously, their discomfort visible in every glance and every subtle movement. The toast had been more than just a celebration, it had been a warning, a test of loyalty and integrity. And as Miss Marple studied the room, she saw it, the terror and realization dawning on the guests, each one grappling with the weight of what they had unknowingly been a part of. Some faces turned pale, others twisted in horror, while a few, like the groom's mother, seemed to go entirely numb, as if the very life had been drained from them. The room was no longer filled with laughter or chatter, but with a suffocating silence, each person caught in the crossfire of their own unspoken guilt. And Miss Marple, ever so patient, continued to watch, her eyes sharp as ever, knowing that this story, this tangled web of lies, betrayals, and long-buried secrets, was far from over. As the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, the true horror of the evening unfolded. The guests were not just witnesses to a family reunion, they were now players in a game far more dangerous, far more thrilling, than they could ever have imagined. As the room remained still, the weight of Miss Marple's words hung heavy in the air. Those who had understood the full scope of what was being said, had reacted subtly, nervous glances exchanged, hands tightening around glasses, or sudden shifts in posture that betrayed their discomfort. These reactions were not of surprise, but recognition of truths they had tried desperately to bury. Finally, Miss Marple, ever so patient, connected all the pieces of the puzzle. The flower, the missing photograph, and the reconstructed toast were not mere coincidences. No, they were deliberate markers, meticulously placed by a hand that sought to erase the groom from the very fabric of the family's history. A deliberate attempt to rewrite the narrative, to bury the truth beneath layers of deceit. It was now glaringly obvious that the culprit was someone close, too close to the family, someone who had used old memories, forgotten moments, and hidden secrets as the fuel for a vengeful grudge. As Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, a quiet certainty settled within her. The culprit was here, among them. The noose was tightening, and it would only be a matter of time before the truth emerged, whether by her hand, or by the inevitable unraveling of history itself. The truth could no longer remain hidden. Miss Marple, poised and composed, sat before the room of expectant faces, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The air was thick with tension, the guests hanging on to her every word, waiting for the resolution they had sought for years. In that moment it seemed as though the entire world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for Miss Marple to deliver the final blow. She did not disappoint. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of years, of secrets buried deep within the walls of the family home. "The bride," she began, her words sending a ripple of shock through the room, "never ran away as everyone believed." A murmur ran through the crowd, but Miss Marple pressed on, her gaze unwavering. She didn't leave out of fear or shame of her impending marriage. No, she left because on that very day, she witnessed a murder. And she fled, not to protect herself, but to protect someone she loved deeply, someone whose life hung in the balance. The room seemed to hold its breath. For the first time, Miss Marple could feel the shock reverberate through each individual. But she did not pause. The truth, she continued, had been concealed beneath layers of guilt and silence. The bride's departure was not an act of cowardice, but a moral decision. a decision made in the shadow of a terrible, terrible truth. She knew what had happened in the moments leading up to her wedding, and in that critical moment, she chose silence. The guests, once so self-assured in their understanding of the events, now sat in stunned silence. Their faces, once full of pride in their well-crafted narrative, were now slack with the dawning realization that they had all been living a lie. The perfect history they had constructed, the one they had clung to for so long, was fragile, a web of deceit barely holding itself together. The bride's sister, who had said little throughout this entire revelation, now trembled, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her handkerchief. Miss Marple noted the subtle shifts in the woman's expression, her once composed façade cracking under the weight of the truth. As the story continued to unfold, it became clear that the entire family had been complicit in this charade, each person hiding their own sins beneath the guise of normalcy. The tension in the room was unbearable, as the truth, long buried, began to rise to the surface. Every guest, every family member, now had a choice: accept the truth, and face the consequences, or continue to pretend that everything was as it should be. The silence that followed Miss Marple's words was not just one of shock, it was the calm before the storm, the moment before everything unraveled. As Miss Marple's words hung in the air, the atmosphere in the room shifted, as if the very walls themselves were holding their breath. The sister, once composed, now trembled uncontrollably, her voice cracking as she finally spoke. I never wanted to make her leave," she whispered, her hands trembling in her lap. "I thought I was protecting her, protecting all of us." Her eyes were glued to the floor, her guilt too overwhelming to bear. "But I made her leave. I thought if we just pretended it never happened, everything would be all right." The weight of her confession was suffocating. Every word she spoke added another layer of truth to the tangled web they had all been trapped in for so long. Miss Marple, ever perceptive, had known the depth of the sister's involvement from the beginning. The silence that had marked her presence for years was no coincidence. It was part of the larger, more elaborate cover-up, her misguided, desperate attempt to shield the bride and the family from the fallout of a truth too dark to reveal. But in hiding the truth, the sister had only deepened the lie, burying it deeper with every passing year, until it festered into something much more dangerous. The room was eerily still, as the sister's words sunk in. "And now look where it's led us," she whispered, her voice barely audible, cracking under the weight of her own regret. A lifetime of lies, all to protect something that should never have been hidden. The depth of her sorrow and realization seemed to pierce through the very fabric of the room. Miss Marple, her face a picture of sorrowful understanding, nodded slowly. She knew that though the truth was painful, it had to be set free. There could be no more hiding. As Miss Marple's gaze swept across the room, she studied the faces of the guests, each one marked by the secrets they had carried for so long. There was no turning back now. It was time for the final pieces of the puzzle to fall into place. "And the mysterious guest," she began, her voice steady now, "wasn't just an interloper. No, he was deeply entangled in a plot far more dangerous than any of us realized." The room shifted uneasily, as Miss Marple's next words hit their mark. "This guest, whom we now know was blackmailing the bride's father, had been involved in a forbidden affair with the groom. A secret affair that, had it been exposed, would have shattered the family forever." A murmur rippled through the room. The guests exchanged startled glances, their faces a mix of disbelief and dawning comprehension. Miss Marple continued. "This guest, driven by greed and a thirst for power, used the groom's past to manipulate him. He threatened to expose the affair unless the groom complied with his demands that went far beyond simple money." The full weight of the situation was now sinking in. A sense of horror began to spread through the room. The mysterious guest had not been some harmless outsider. He was a puppet master, pulling strings to exploit the groom's hidden past for his own gain. As Miss Marple's words sank deeper, the connection between the guest's blackmail and the escalating tension in the family became painfully clear. The guest had been desperate for money, yes, but also for something more: power, control. And when the groom, cornered by the threat of exposure, refused to comply, things had taken a deadly turn. The situation, once carefully contained, spiraled out of control. The guest's death, Miss Marple said, her voice colder now, was not an accident. It was the result of someone, or rather someone's, desperate to keep the family's reputation intact. Someone close to the groom. Someone who was willing to go to any length to protect their legacy, no matter the cost. Her eyes flicked around the room, studying each guest carefully. The truth was now undeniable. The mysterious guest's death had been no random act of violence. It was calculated. It was deliberate. And at the heart of it, someone had been willing to sacrifice everything to keep the family's darkest secrets from being exposed. The room fell into a tense silence, the realization hanging thick in the air. The pieces had fallen into place, and now the truth was laid bare for all to see. Each person in the room, no matter how closely they had been involved, was now tied to the dark web of lies, manipulation, and murder that had plagued this family for years. The room remained eerily still, the silence now a tangible weight pressing down on everyone present. Miss Marple's tone shifted, growing colder, more deliberate, as she let the truth unfurl with a chilling clarity. The killer, she began, her voice steady but unyielding, was someone who believed that their silence was an act of loyalty. A person who thought that by burying the truth, they were preserving peace, shielding their family from the storm that had threatened to tear them apart. Her gaze swept over the room, each word cutting through the tension like a knife. Her eyes settled on one person, the bride's sister. The woman's hands trembled violently, her face pale, yet she made no move to defend herself. She was the one who had lived with the heavy burden of family secrets, choosing to protect the illusion of peace at any cost. And in doing so, she had committed an unforgivable act. The sister, Miss Marple continued, her voice now colder than ever, did not act out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of losing everything. Fear that the fragile peace she had helped create would be shattered forever. And so, in the most desperate moment, she chose to silence the one person who had the power to expose the truth. The words hit like a hammer, the revelation hanging in the air like smoke. The sister gasped, her breath quickening, as the reality of her actions sank in. She had spent years holding the family together with her silence, protecting them from scandal, from the consequences of their own mistakes. But in the process, she had sealed her fate, and the fate of those she loved. As the sister's face drained of color, Miss Marple's voice softened, a final reflection on the tangled web of deceit and fear that had brought them to this point. Some silences, Miss Marple mused, her tone turning almost wistful, are meant to shield love, to protect those we care about from unbearable pain. But there are other silences. She paused, her eyes glinting with quiet understanding, that conceal rot, decay, and both, in the end, demand a price. She glanced around at the room, her gaze lingering on each face. The guests, each one now irrevocably connected to the web of lies they had all spun, shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. No one was free from the consequences of the truth that had finally come to light. The damage, Miss Marple continued, her voice firm and final, cannot be undone. There is no simple resolution here, no way to erase the past. The weight of her words settled over the room like a funeral shroud. Everyone was now aware of the cost of their silence, and the price they had all paid for trying to protect their image at the expense of the truth. The bride's sister sat motionless, a broken figure now exposed for the role she had played in this tragedy. Miss Marple stood, her face still a mask of quiet resolve, and for a moment, she lingered in the doorway, her mind reflecting on the twisted paths that had led them here. She had solved the mystery, yes, but at what cost? The truth had been spoken, and though it offered no comfort, no easy answers, it was the only thing that could bring any semblance of redemption. She exhaled a quiet sigh, her thoughts heavy with the weight of it all. As she walked out, leaving the room behind her, The truth lingered in the silence she left in her wake, inescapable, unrelenting, and ultimately the only thing that could ever set them free. The silence in the room was finally shattered, but its echoes would reverberate for years, a constant reminder of the hidden truths that had come to light. As the dust settled, it became clear that the revelations were only the beginning of a much deeper and more painful journey. Thank you for joining me on this harrowing exploration of the dark secrets of St. Mary's Soul. As our story comes to its close, remember this: silence, while often seen as a refuge, can also be a dangerous prison, a place where truths lie dormant, waiting to break free when least expected. In the case of Miss Marple and the silent wedding, we learned that sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest, most devastating truths. The bride's decision to flee her wedding was not an act of cowardice, as some might have believed, but a desperate, heart-wrenching attempt to protect someone she loved deeply. But in her absence, the actions of her own sister, driven by an overwhelming sense of duty and fear, set in motion a chain of events that would unravel a tightly knit family. The tangled web of betrayal, blackmail, and long-held grudges revealed just how far people will go to protect their own, how even the most pristine facades can hide the deepest sorrow and darkest guilt. And yet, despite the pain and the secrecy, there is a question that lingers long after the story has ended. What if the silence, which was once meant to shield those we love, had instead opened the door to redemption? Could the truth, harsh and unforgiving as it might have been, have saved them all from the spiral of lies and despair they found themselves trapped in? Or was the pain of revelation, always inevitable, the only way to break free from the grip of deception? As you reflect on this, I would love to hear your thoughts. If you were in Miss Marple's shoes, how would you have handled the burden of such a mystery? Do you believe that breaking the silence would have healed the fractured bonds? Or would it have triggered even darker consequences that no one could have predicted? Share your theories, your reflections and your own interpretations of the events in the comments below. If you've enjoyed unraveling this complex tale with me, please consider subscribing for more intriguing mysteries. Share this video with friends and family who appreciate a well-spun tale, and together, let's keep the spirit of these timeless stories alive. Your support means everything. And with each of you we can continue to explore the mysteries that lie beneath the surface of the stories we hold dear. Thank you for joining me in this journey of truth and silence. Until next time, remember, sometimes it is the silence that speaks the loudest.